Welcome back. In this lesson, let's take a look at what Create Next app has already set up for us. Let's open up our project Discover Coffee Stores that we created in a previous lesson in the editor of our choice. Now I'm going to be using VS Code as my editor throughout this course, but please feel free to use whatever you're comfortable with. All right, let's begin. And I'm going to open up the project Discover Coffee Stores from my file system. Selecting Discover Coffee Stores and hit open. All right, sweet. So now that I have my project opened up, you can already see the directories and files that Create Next app has already set up for us. Now, before we proceed, let's take a look at a diagram that will help us create a mind map of all the files and folders that have been created for us by Create Next app. This will really help us understand how it's all structured, and we know exactly where to go when we start building the app further. So this is that diagram. This is Create Next app, and these are all the directories and files located right underneath it. One thing to note here is that anything that you see that has a rectangular box around it, that's essentially a directory. But anything that doesn't is essentially a file. All right, let's start with package.json. Now, in package.json, there are two main sections, scripts and dependencies. Now, we are already familiar with the script section, right? Because we did use the script npm run dev to start our development server. And these two scripts would be something we would take a look at later in the course. The next is dependencies. Now, in the dependencies section, the first thing we see here is the Next.js dependency. Now, since this is a Next.js application, we do need Next.js. But we also need React and React DOM. So why is that? Well, it's because Next is a framework built on top of React. So we do need these two dependencies as well to write React code and build components. All right, now that we are a bit familiar with package.json, let's move on to the next one, which is the pages directory. Now, pages is the most important part of a Next.js application. Now, Next.js does provide us with a built-in routing system. The pages folder will mainly contain all your page files, and anytime there is a React component inside a pages directory, Next.js will automatically create a route for them based on its file name. So let's start by looking at index.js. Now, going to the pages directory, going to index.js, you will notice that this is a component called home, and this is all React code. This is a React component. And this component is essentially rendered right here. This is all React code itself, and the route is by default the root of the page. Now going back here, you will notice that this is called index.js, but in fact the name of the component is home. And the reason is because by default, index becomes the default route under the pages directory. So even though this is called home, the fact that this is called index, it becomes the default route itself. All right. But how do we go about creating a new route? So let's do that together. Let's create a new component called hello. And this will be a very basic React component. So let's create a new file called hello.js. Now, the minute we do that, Next.js is going to look at this specific file name itself to create a route called /hello. But before we do that, let's create a component. So I'm going to say const hello. And this component will be a very simple component. So let's just return some text, hello world. Now, as we do that, this component is still not exposed to the Next.js routing system, because we are not exporting it yet. So one important thing to note here is that we also need to export this. So we say export default hello, and this component will be exported by default from this file. So now if we go to our browser and say /hello, because that's the name of our file, we can easily route to it. And there you go, hello world. And this is the beauty of the Next.js file system, that the minute you create a file based on its file name, it's going to create that route automatically. Now, if you do remember, when we created React applications without Next.js, we had to set up something called as a React router. And this was an additional step on top of our existing application. Now, with Next.js, it's extremely simple because it's all based on the file system itself, which is pretty sweet. All right, now that we have learned more about index.js, let's move on to _app.js. What is _app.js? App.js is essentially an entry point in our application. Think of it as like the main entry point. It essentially provides a wrapper that surrounds all the pages. You can use it to add any UI components that are available on every page, like let's say the footer component, as we see right here. So you can add this footer component in _app.js and it will be available everywhere. This is essentially a gist of app.js. All right, going back to the next thing, which is the API folder. Now, Next.js does provide us with an ability to add our backend server-side code alongside our front-end code. It provides a solution to build your API within Next.js within the same project. Now, there is a lot more to it that we will take a look at in a future lesson. But for now, let's move on to the public folder. Now, in the public folder, you will essentially save things like images, icons, or any files that are static. For example, even fonts. So in this case, there are two files already set up for us, which is the favicon, and the second is the vercel.svg as well. Moving on to the styles directory. Now in the styles directory, there are two files, global.css and home.module.css. So what exactly is global.css? As the name indicates, global.css are styles that will be applied throughout your application. So going to the styles directory, opening global.css. In global.css, you will notice this font family is essentially set up for the entire application. And this is what you would do right here. You add a font family once, and that should set up your fonts for all the pages. Moving on to the next file. All right, home.module.css is a CSS module. And Next.js has already set up CSS modules for us, so you get it out of the box. So what exactly are CSS modules? CSS modules are a way where you can add a CSS file, and that CSS file will automatically get associated to that specific component based on its file name. So for example, in our case, home.module.css will get associated to the home component. Any styles that you declare inside this specific file will only be available inside the home component, since it's scoped to the component itself. And that is the beauty of CSS modules. Now, there's a lot more to it, and we will get more in depth in the styling section. But for now, let's move on. We have learned so much more about the setup, but there are still some things that we haven't explored yet, which we will take a look at later in the course. So I'll see you in the next one.